My daughter screamed inside a locked museum closet, while Karen smiled at the ribbon cutting, pretending she couldn't hear anything at all. Grace pounded on that steel door with her fists, and the HOA president just sipped champagne, calling it protocol. I'm Melissa Turner, single mom to 10-year-old Grace, who loves airplanes more than anything else on Earth. Our HOA sat beside a tiny municipal airport, home to a volunteer-run aviation museum everyone in town adored. Deborah Sinclair ran both the HOA and the museum, deciding who belonged and who quietly didn't matter. Grace used a wheelchair and a speech tablet, but she knew every plane model better than most adults. Deborah smiled at council meetings, yet her eyes flicked over Grace like an inconvenience to be managed. At the spring open house, Deborah moved Grace's accessible ramp temporarily to store extra folding chairs instead. Grace couldn't reach the World War II exhibit, and Deborah shrugged, saying accommodations weren't in this year's budget. I complained politely. Deborah smiled wider and reminded me volunteers shouldn't make waves during fundraising season. Grace's tablet chimed her favorite word, Spitfire, right as Deborah rolled her eyes at another parent. That night, an anonymous museum volunteer texted me. Watch her closely. This isn't the first time. Founders Day approached, and Deborah announced a board members-only preview hour inside the restoration wing. Grace, invited earlier by a kind curator assistant, arrived early, thrilled to see the restored fighter plane. Deborah intercepted us at the door, snapping that unapproved guests weren't allowed near delicate artifacts. I explained Grace had written permission. Deborah tore the printed email in half without reading it. She ordered a teenage volunteer to move Grace's wheelchair into the storage annex for safety reasons. The annex door had a keypad lock Deborah controlled personally, installed after last year's incident, she said. I asked what incident she meant. Deborah's face tightened, and she quickly changed the subject entirely. Grace's tablet buzzed with panic, sound she used when overwhelmed, but Deborah waved dismissively, walking away. I tried following, but a volunteer blocked me, insisting board protocol required undisturbed preview time inside. Through the annex window, I saw Grace's small hands slapping the glass, her mouth open, silent. Deborah stood outside sipping champagne, chatting with donors, completely ignoring the muffled banging behind her. I demanded she unlock the door immediately. Deborah said the code was temporarily unavailable during ceremonies. 20 minutes passed. Grace's breathing tablet alert kept firing, warning of rising heart rate and distress. A maintenance worker whispered that Deborah had disabled the annex's backup exit months earlier, oddly enough. I threatened to call the fire department. Deborah laughed, saying I was dramatizing a simple scheduling issue. Finally, another volunteer secretly punched in an override code, and the annex door clicked open, shaking. Grace collapsed into my arms, tablet dropped, tears streaking her face, still whispering Spitfire over and over. Deborah simply said, "She's fine," and turned back to the champagne table like nothing happened. For a week, Deborah avoided me, focusing instead on Founders Day publicity photos and donor thank you calls. Grace slowly calmed down, sketching airplane wings on her tablet, refusing to discuss the annex at all. I filed a formal HOA complaint, though the board secretary hinted Deborah controlled which complaints ever surfaced. Then a strange envelope appeared in my mailbox, old photographs of the museum, decades before Deborah arrived. The photos showed my late father-in-law, an Air Force veteran, restoring that very World War II fighter plane himself. Deborah's museum plaques credited only herself for the restoration, never mentioning the man who actually did it. I brought the photos to Deborah, expecting embarrassment. Instead, she accused me of forging historical documents. She threatened legal action for defamation and warned the HOA board I was becoming a troublemaker. That week, Deborah announced Grace's mobility ramp would be permanently removed for liability reasons, effective immediately. Parents at the meeting protested, but Deborah reminded everyone she personally funded half the museum's renovations. Grace's teacher called, worried. Grace kept drawing the annex door in therapy, refusing to say why. I learned Deborah had quietly applied for a federal accessibility grant, claiming full credit for improvements never made. A volunteer leaked Deborah's grant paperwork to me, showing renovation dates matching her personal kitchen remodel instead. The delicate artifact Deborah guarded so fiercely was actually my father-in-law's handwritten flight logbook hidden away. Deborah had quietly listed the logbook as museum property, planning to sell it to a private collector. I confronted her again. Deborah smiled coldly, saying grieving mothers shouldn't play detective with things above them. That night, Deborah's own teenage son knocked on my door, looking terrified, holding his phone tightly. He said he'd recorded his mother locking Grace inside, too scared to show anyone until now. He also revealed Deborah had banned a disabled veteran years earlier, the very incident she'd hidden before. I finally understood. Deborah wasn't protecting artifacts. She was protecting years of quiet lies and control. Founders Day's grand unveiling was approaching, with a Smithsonian curator flying in to authenticate the logbook. Deborah panicked privately, scrambling to forge provenance papers before the curator could examine anything closely. I contacted the Smithsonian curator directly, sharing my father-in-law's photographs and original wartime flight records quietly. The curator, Dr. Alan Reyes, seemed intrigued, promising to review everything personally before the public ceremony. Deborah discovered my email and accused me of sabotaging the museum's biggest fundraising night in years. She threatened to ban Grace permanently from HOA property, calling her disruptive in front of other parents. Grace, watching quietly, typed on her tablet, "Grandpa flew that plane. It's not our plane." The teenage son agreed to testify, still frightened, but determined to stop his mother's growing lies. Founders Day arrived with cameras, donors, reporters, and Deborah standing proudly beside the covered fighter plane. Dr. Reyes arrived early, quietly requesting the original logbook before allowing Deborah's scripted unveiling speech to begin. Deborah stalled, insisting the logbook was in restoration, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. Dr. Reyes calmly announced he'd already reviewed archival records, and the provenance papers didn't match at all. He held up my father-in-law's original handwritten logbook, comparing it publicly to Deborah's fabricated documentation instantly. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Dr. Reyes explained the logbook belonged to a decorated Air Force veteran. Deborah insisted it was museum property. Dr. Reyes replied the grant paperwork proved otherwise, quietly, precisely. The HOA treasurer, standing nearby, admitted Deborah's renovation invoices never matched actual accessibility work completed anywhere. Deborah's son stepped forward, shaking, and played the recording of his mother locking Grace inside. The crowd fell silent as Grace's panicked cries echoed through speakers meant for celebration, not confession. Deborah screamed it was a private family matter, but reporters were already filming every furious word. I stepped forward, showing the veteran's photographs, proving my father-in-law restored the plane decades earlier. Dr. Reyes confirmed the sketches matched Grace's tablet drawings, saying, "This family's legacy is undeniable." The HOA board, humiliated publicly, immediately called for an emergency vote on Deborah's presidency right there. Neighbors who'd stayed silent for years finally spoke up, describing Deborah's years of quiet manipulation and threats. Deborah tried defending herself, but her own forged signature on grant documents condemned her completely, undeniably. Security asked Deborah to step away from the podium, while officials reviewed the fraudulent grant paperwork immediately. The crowd, once admiring her, now watched coldly as Deborah's championed reputation collapsed within mere minutes. Grace, from her wheelchair, typed calmly, "Grandpa's plane. My museum now," and the crowd erupted applauding. Deborah was removed as HOA president and museum director, facing federal charges for grant fraud and forgery. The museum renamed its restoration wing after my father-in-law, installing permanent accessible ramps throughout the entire building. Grace now visits weekly as honorary junior curator, laughing beside Dr. Reyes, finally safe, finally seen, finally home.